Why does silence, the absence of everything, keep some people awake? A room with no sound should be the ideal sleep environment. Nothing to process, nothing to react to, nothing competing for attention. And yet, for a significant portion of the population, silence at bedtime is the worst possible condition. The moment the lights go off and the last sound disappears, something starts. Not a thought exactly, more like a narrator that was waiting in the wings for the stage to clear. It begins with a replay of the day, then a preview of tomorrow, then a question that does not have an answer, then another, then a memory from 4 years ago that carries an emotion that was never processed. Within minutes, the silent room is the loudest environment the person has been in all day. They reach for the phone, press play on something, anything, rain, a podcast, an old show, and within minutes sleep comes. The paradox is obvious. Noise fixed what silence broke. The question is why. This week, the brain on phone calls, on apologies, and now, at 2 a.m, negotiating with the dark. 3 formats, 1 pattern, a brain that manages its operating conditions by controlling the signal environment. The mechanism starts with a network that Marcus Reichel and colleagues identified in 2001. The default mode network, a set of brain regions that activate specifically when nothing external is demanding attention. During the day, this network runs in the background while the prefrontal cortex handles tasks, conversations, decisions. The DMN waits. It processes residual data, unfinished thoughts, unresolved social interactions, future scenarios, self-referential evaluation. It is the brain's maintenance crew working the night shift while the executive system handles the day. The problem is that the DMN does not have an off switch. When the last task of the day ends, when the phone is put down, the lights go off and the room goes quiet. The DMN does not wind down. It steps forward. It has been accumulating material all day, and now, with no competition from external input, it has full access to conscious attention. The narrator takes the stage. Hamilton and colleagues in 2011 demonstrated that people with higher DMN activity at rest report more rumination, repetitive self-focused thought that loops without resolving. The content is not random. It is weighted toward threat assessment, social evaluation, and unfinished emotional business. The brain in the dark, in silence, with nothing to process externally, turns inward and begins processing the backlog. For some people, this backlog is manageable. The thoughts arrive, pass through, and the brain settles. For others, particularly those with higher baseline cortical activity, higher trait anxiety, or a tendency toward reflective processing, the backlog is dense. The thoughts do not pass, they stack, they interlink. One unresolved question triggers another. The volume rises, and sleep, which requires the prefrontal cortex to disengage and the thalamus to gate incoming signals, becomes impossible as long as the internal signal is this loud. Enter the noise, and the mechanism is more specific than most people realize. It is called competitive inhibition. Rausch and colleagues documented this in the auditory processing system. When an external auditory signal is present, it occupies processing bandwidth in the auditory cortex. That bandwidth is then unavailable for processing internal signals, including the internal narration generated by the DMN. The noise does not stop the thoughts, it outcompetes them. It gives the auditory cortex a task: process this rain. This voice, this hum, and in doing so it reduces the resources available for the default mode narrator to reach conscious attention. The DMN is still active. The thoughts are still forming, but they are forming below the threshold of awareness because the auditory system is busy with something else. The person does not fall asleep because the noise relaxed them. They fall asleep because the noise occupied the channel that was keeping them awake. This explains why different types of noise work for different people, and why the specifics matter more than most sleep advice acknowledges. White noise, a uniform, featureless sound containing all frequencies at equal intensity, works by providing a constant, low-information signal that the auditory cortex can process on autopilot. It is competitive inhibition at its simplest. Fill the channel with something that demands minimal processing power but enough to keep the system occupied. Rain sounds, fan noise, and ocean waves operate on the same principle. They are predictable enough to not trigger alertness, present enough to keep the auditory cortex busy, and varied enough to not become rhythmically aversive. Pink noise, weighted toward lower frequencies, has been shown by Mesnao and colleagues in 2017 to improve sleep quality metrics specifically because its frequency profile matches the brain's preferred resting state pattern more closely than white noise does. The brain finds it less effortful to process, which means the occupation of the auditory channel costs fewer resources. Familiar speech, a podcast episode heard before, a show watched dozens of times, works through an entirely different mechanism. The familiarity means the brain does not need to decode new information. The prediction error is near zero, exactly like the rewatching mechanism from earlier in the cycle. The auditory cortex is better, the content is known, and the brain relaxes into a state of confirmed prediction rather than active processing. For some people, music with lyrics fails because the language processing system engages too actively, pulling the prefrontal cortex back online. For others, only a specific voice works, a narrator whose cadence the brain has already modelled so completely that listening requires almost no conscious effort. The voice becomes a lullaby, the content of which is irrelevant. The paradox, reframed. These people do not need noise because they cannot tolerate silence. They need noise because silence, for their specific brain, is not quiet. Silence is the condition under which the internal volume is highest. External sound is not an addiction or a crutch. It is a competitive inhibitor, a tool the brain uses to manage which signals reach consciousness during the transition to sleep. The strategy is elegant. It uses the architecture of the auditory system against the architecture of the default mode system. Noise versus narrator, processing bandwidth versus rumination, and for most people who use this strategy, it works exactly as designed. One nuance keeps this from being a clean validation. There is a difference between a brain that uses noise to manage a busy default mode and a brain that uses noise to avoid hearing what the default mode is saying. The first is regulation. The DMN is active, the content is routine, daily leftovers, planning fragments, nothing requiring attention. External noise keeps the channel clear so sleep can arrive. The second is avoidance. The DMN is surfacing material that the person does not want to engage with, unresolved grief, a decision being postponed, a relationship question that has been shelved for months. The noise keeps that material below the threshold, night after night, and the processing never happens. The sleep comes, but the backlog grows. One test. On a night without noise, what does the brain produce in the first 5 minutes? If it is random chatter, the strategy is regulation. If the same theme returns every time, the narrator is trying to deliver a message, and the noise might be intercepting it. Next week, the territory shifts. 3 videos on what happens when the nervous system builds survival strategies that outlast the situations that created them. People who never ask for help, people who try to please everyone, people who disappear without warning. The Fawn Response trilogy, and none of it is what it looks like from the outside.